If you're an athlete, you know the greatest motivator of all is the fear of letting your teammates down. After all, a team is only as good as its weakest link. So you owe it to those wearing the same jersey as you to be your best every time you step on the field. That's why there's no vape in team. When you vape, you can expose your lungs to toxic chemicals that can damage your lungs. If you're a step behind, the team's a step behind. Brought to you by The Real Cost and the FDA.
Want to save on some of the biggest names in streaming on the network made for streaming? X marks the spot. Get Xfinity Internet and add the new Stream Saver that includes Peacock, Apple TV Plus, and Netflix. Just $15 a month. All your favorites, all in one place, only from Xfinity. So go ahead and binge some shows, stream some movies, and save some money all at the same time. For more watching and less spending, X marks the spot. Switch at Xfinity.com today. Restrictions apply. Taxes extra. Price subject to change.
Hey everyone, welcome to this edition of Keep Watch Pass on the It's Not That Bad podcast channel, a proud member of the Pantheon Podcast Network. I am curious if you, our dear listeners, are going to be able to hear my bones creak as I introduce our topic today, because we are going to take a step back 40 years into the past and take a look at films released in 1984. 40 freaking years. And I can feel it in every single bone of my body. But here to join me on this trip down amnesia lane, I can only call it, my lovely wife, Carrie. Carrie, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great and ready to take this 40-year journey with you.
So here's what's going to happen. We're going to take a look at the year 1984 and pick 3 movies each, a keep, a watch, and a pass. The keep, of course, is one we hold in high regard and probably still holds true 40 years later. The watch is one that, hey, you know what? 40 years, kind of cool nostalgia. I'm cool with it, even if there's commercials. And the pass is one that, even 40 years later, we probably still wouldn't watch. But before we get into those, Karen, I'm going to ask you, as you were doing your research for this and you realize some of the films that were released and are now 40 freaking years old, how old did you feel?
Okay, well, to put it into perspective, I actually, in 84, didn't even own a VHS player. It wasn't until 1985, the summer of 1985, when the Care Bears movie came out. And I recall bugging my parents, begging, pleading, promising to eat my Brussels sprouts and go to bed on time with no argument if they would only please rent a VHS player so I could rent the VHS copy at our local video store of the Care Bears movie, released in 1985, which means, if you do the math, in 84, I wasn't really into watching movies. However, I do appreciate a list of movies that were made that year. So I guess I'm going to do my best and talk about them.
The funny thing, too, is if you were just getting a VCR in 1985, that means those first batch of movies were probably the ones that were released in 1984, which were the new releases on VHS. Because I don't know if you, our dear listeners, are of a vintage like we are, but there was a time when you actually had to wait a long ass time to be able to rent a film after its theatrical run. Those were long, tedious days. But when they came out on VHS, you probably only got like the 1-day rental until a couple of months later. Then it was a 3-day rental. And then a couple months later, and it was the 7-day rental. I miss Blockbuster.
Well, I can guarantee that I never saw any of these movies in the theater.
See, I'm taking a look back at this. One of them I might have seen in the theater. I don't remember seeing it in the theater, but I do remember watching the crap out of it on like First Choice Super Channel, which was the pay network at the time. A couple of them actually I know I watched a bunch of times. Also, I hate to break your little heart, my dear love.
And don't do it.
But the Care Bears movie qualifies for the podcast.
Oh, that's it. I shall defend.
All right. Well, at least now I know what I got you doing over the next few weeks. Rewatching the 1985 The Care Bears movie.
And I will Care Bear stare down the critics.
And I will put a big picture of coffee on my chest and get ready for that one. But it's now time to jump into the fray of 1984 with our Keep, Watch, and Pass picks. So, Carrie, your Keep pick from 1984.
Obviously, the best movie released that year was Ghostbusters. And I'm for sure, even now, 40 years later, watching the original lineup of the Ghostbusters.
What does it say about Ghostbusters that even still, to this day, 40 years later, and they're still trying to find the special sauce that made that film what it is? And I'm not saying that Frozen Empire was bad or anything, but it's really hard to find the formula that actually matches. I mean, I think the last two films really have done a decent job of finding the heart of what made Ghostbusters. I mean, Ghostbusters 2, I mean, it's okay. It's okay. Ghostbusters Answer the Call, I know someday we're going to have to talk about on this show for sure. 40 years later, and that film is still quotable. I'm not saying I randomly walk around saying if someone calls you a god or asks if you're a god, you say yes, because...
And don't cross the streams.
Yeah, well, exactly. True in Ghostbusters as it is at the urinal wall. But that being said, I try to stay away from some of the obvious picks. I mean, yes, you're right. Ghostbusters might be the be-all end-all of 1984. You'd be hard-pressed to find a lot of people who would argue that fact. It really did set the tone for the entire year.
Well, doing my research, it was like every page that I brought up, top movies of 1984, and boom, Ghostbusters is it's leading the charge on all websites. So,
oh, yeah.
And I agree. I
justly
think
so, yes.
It is. It's a formula that has stood the test of time. And even now, like, it's a classic. And I love that they're still giving nod to even the original, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Hey, it's Kaylee Cuoco for Priceline. Ready to go to your happy place for a happy price? Well, why didn't you say so? Just download the Priceline app right now and save up to 60% on hotels. So whether it's Cousin Kevin's Kazoo Concert in Kansas City, go Kevin, or Becky's Bachelorette Bash in Bermuda, you never have to miss a trip ever again. So download the Priceline app today. Your savings are waiting.
Go to your happy place for a happy price. Go to your happy price, Priceline.
So, in keeping with my not so obvious picks, anyone who knows me will probably say, well, that your keep pick is going to be pretty obvious, but it's not one of the bigger name films, but I freaking love this film. It is The Last Starfighter. I love this film. Like, to my core, I love this film. So let me explain, because Carrie, I'm going to ask you, have you actually seen The Last Starfighter?
Nope. Clearly, it's not one that you love enough to
share with you.
Have said, "Hey, hon, let's put this movie on. It's my favorite movie."
But the thing is, it's not
that
necessarily
I'm calling you out. Or
well,
anything.
But the thing is, it's not necessarily my favorite movie, but it's definitely one that, because when you have a topic like this, right, a year, there's definitely room for a volume 2 and a volume 3. So I'm sure 10 years down the road, when we come back to, 2034, we can do a volume 2 of movies from 1984. Yeah, well, that's if we're still doing the podcast in 10 years. I'd be happy doing it. I don't know if the listeners will be happy listening to me for another 10 years, but we'll keep trying. But here's the thing. With The Last Starfighter, you have Alex, who is he's a gamer, right? Like, he loves to play this one arcade game. He lives in this small town. And then all of a sudden, he beats the game. And then a spaceship comes down. Very similar to the spaceship from the video game that he played in. And he realizes this arcade game is actually a recruiting tool. So he gets brought up into space to help fight these hordes of aliens while a clone of him is stuck on Earth, making sure that no one realizes that he's gone up to space. Freaking love The Last Starfighter. And honestly, if you have kids that like video games, this might actually be a good film for them. It's a ton of fun, and it has that Disney-esque kind of, because it's not a Disney film, but it has a very Disney-esque kind of feel to it, where young kid goes on an adventure. Not a kid, but he's an older teenager, but it's so good. And yes, the special effects don't necessarily hold up, but the story allows you to be able to lose yourself in the story and not get hung up on the on the look of the graphics 40 years later. But I tell you, in 1984, that was the absolute freaking bomb. My watch film is a little out there. My watch film cannot be defined. It cannot. I defy you to pigeonhole this film. So let me try and the best way I can describe this film before I tell you what the film is. And this is going to sound like word salad here, but bear with me. It's a 50s dystopian musical mob mafia movie about a singer who gets kidnapped and a mercenary for hire who happens to be the ex-girlfriend of the singer hired to get her back. I'm talking about Streets of Fire, starring Michael Paré, Diane Lane, Rick Moranis, and Willem Dafoe, turning every single scene into a buffet because he came to eat and chew the scenery he did, all the while wearing something that looks like a discount Glad garbage bag coveralls. It is, I don't know if it's supposed to be like, the mob has this greaser 50s kind of feel, but yet it feels like a dystopian rundown. And then there's a musical aspect to it, and you have freaking Rick Moranis as an asshole agent, which you would never picture Rick Moranis playing an asshole, but here we are with Streets of Fire in 1984. A very young Diane Lane killing it. Oh my God. Like, you have to watch this film. It is so 80s. I don't even know how to describe it. I honestly, dear listeners, if you have seen Streets of Fire and you can classify this film, please let us know. I am curious how you would classify it. Carrie, you're looking at me like, what the hell are you on? You just threw a bunch of words out and tried to turn it into a description. Have you seen this film?
No, never even heard of it.
Like, it is, it's something. It definitely is something for sure. There's something about a film that doesn't allow itself to be easily classified. Like, they could have turned this into like a straight greaser film kind of thing, like a 1950s retro kind of feel, and be fine with it. But then there's also the musical aspect of it. But it also feels like a very, Warriors kind of feel. Like, almost, I don't know. I don't even know where to begin to describe this film. But I remember it was being on the First Choice Super Channel stations, and I don't know what it is. I just do not know what it is about this film. It hooked me. It absolutely hooked me. And I'm not the only one who got hooked by it, because over at Rotten Tomatoes, it has a 69% tomatometer. So clearly I'm not the only one thinking that, and a 70% audience score. for once, the critics and the audience are in almost lockstep agreement with this film. It's solid. Like, if you don't mind watching a film that doesn't feel cookie cutter, watch Streets of Fire. Just remember that it's 40 years old and the music is supposed to sound like that. But now, Carrie, what is your watch pick from 1984?
Can I just say how shocked and, dare I say, disappointed in you I am right now?
Have I let you down?
I think you have, yes. I'm intrigued because I think that 84 would have been Rick Moranis' year. I absolutely loved him in Ghostbusters, and I can't picture him ever playing
An asshole.
How dare you say an asshole and Rick Moranis in the same sentence? But I'm intrigued. I would watch that movie. However, the fact that you did not pick the same movie for your watch, almost disappointing.
So how have I disappointed you, and what did you go with?
I went with Spinal Tap. And how could you not have? I know you were staying away from the obvious, but that movie is just so good and so watchable and so quotable.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
that
but
I'm disappointed.
I kind of live Spinal Tap, though. I mean, not that we've blown up any drummers, but I kind of live Spinal Tap. Like, when you play enough shows, you have some stories to tell. But I mean, yeah,
Dark, evil, satanic monster.
Stonehenge.
We salute you.
I tried to stay away from the obvious picks, and picking Spinal Tap and picking Ghostbusters for me would have been like you could have called that one a mile away. But yes, this is Spinal Tap is the definitive mockumentary, not just of 1984. I'm talking of all time. And the fascinating thing about this is that you have Spinal Tap, a band made up of actors who happen to write their own music and play their own instruments and have toured, which makes them more real than some acts out there. And freaking love it to this day. If you have ever played in a band, at some point you have wanted to get up on the microphone saying, "Hello, Cleveland," even though you're definitely not in Cleveland. But yeah, Spinal Tap for sure, for days, absolutely. And now we get to your past pick. So from 1984, what found your list?
Well, I have a disclaimer for this, okay? This is not a knock on the movie itself. I'm sure it's a very great movie, but I haven't seen it in 40 years. And so I feel that after 40 years, after 4 decades, it's pretty safe to say that I might continue to pass on Firestarter. I've never seen it. I'm sure that it's a very great movie. I love Drew Barrymore. I think she's great, but I never saw the movie, so I'm going to continue. I'm going to continue this 40-year run and pass.
I will say that it is hard to be able to translate a Stephen King novel to the silver screen. And you're actually not alone in thinking about Firestarter, because it has only a 38% tomatometer over on Rotten Tomatoes. And I'll admit, I have not seen it. Rare is the actual film based on a Stephen King book that has worked for me. I think you have to go back to a film like Cujo, which was just so raw and just so like almost real. Like Pet Sematary is kind of out there. Although that being said, Pet Sematary also gave us a great Ramones song on the soundtrack. Love it. Christine, Maximum Overdrive, based on a short story by Stephen King. Yeah, okay, cool. The Stand, the TV movie, half of it, yes. Again, very similar to the book. Half the book, great. Can't put it down. The other half of the book, not so much.
How about The Shining or Misery?
Maybe it's because I'm not the biggest horror fan. And I hate to say that. Like, I don't shun any genre by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that horror has never been my jam. Slasher films, especially the more goofy, you could say, the better. I think that's why Jason X is one of my favorite Friday the 13th films, because it's just so out there and just so stupid, silly fun that it's kind of enjoyable in a weird kind of way. But with Stephen King, it's like all of a sudden you have to take it seriously, because it is a freaking Stephen King story adapted for the screen. And the fact that they're still trying to make this film today, the remake didn't do so well. The original didn't do so well. Just leave well enough alone and write original stories. The concept is good. Maybe just read the book. Just read the book is always better. Guaranteed. I may shock you with my past pick, because it is in the geek realm. And recently it has seen a resurgence thanks to the beautiful direction of Denis Villeneuve. I'm, of course, talking about Dune, but the 1984 Dune. Look, I mentioned the book is always better. I didn't even like the book. Like, I tried. I read it. Frank Herbert's Dune is a slog of a book. I could not. There was a point where I wanted to turn it into a drinking game, because Frank Herbert has this thing with using the word presently, ever presently. Thank God I didn't turn into a drinking game. My liver would not have forgiven me for that. But the thing is, Dune plays out as a very Game of Thrones-esque, but of course set in space. But it doesn't play out as well. George R.R. Martin, in creating Game of Thrones, created a story, like a very epic story that he still has to finish. But that played well, and that translated well to the screen. I mean, anyone who has seen any episode of Game of Thrones has to agree that even if you're not a big fan of the story, it's epic and captivating, and was able to carry for as long as it did, and was one of the best things on TV. This film, I mean, it's also 1984. Like, there's a lot in this film, or in the book, that could not be translated to film in 1984. And try as they might, it just wasn't cutting it. The new Dune, I've tried to watch it, and it bores me. It does. It is. It's well done. Denis Villeneuve is a phenomenal director. It's in the right hands. But I find the story boring. And if I find the story boring, then I'm not going to get into the movie, no matter how well it's done and no matter how well it's acted. Dune, for me, is a pass. Then and now. And it's all based on my inability to enjoy the book. And I can't get past that. I recognize that's me. There are other people out there going, Dune is a masterpiece. Say it. Because if it is to you, then that's great. It just did not hit with me. All right, Carrie, thank you so much for this. Now, please, before we go, please let our listeners know what your keep, watch, and past picks were from 40 years ago, 1984.
From 40 years ago, I am keeping Ghostbusters today, tomorrow, forever and always. I'm watching Spinal Tap because it's just awesome. And I'm continuing the run and passing on Firestarter.
All right. I am keeping The Last Starfighter. I am watching Streets of Fire. And I am passing on the 1984 version of Dune. Thank you so much for this. And to you, our listeners, you guys know the drill. If there is a topic that you want us to cover on Keep, Watch, Pass, hit us up on social media at Not That Badcast, or go to our website at notthatbadcast.com. And while you're there, be sure to check out our Coming Soon page so you can get your chime-ins on the episodes that we are working on. We want to hear from you. We want to shout you out in the show. Drop us a line. Until next time, she's Carrie, I'm Jay. You guys are awesome. This is Keep Watch Pass on the It's Not That Bad podcast channel, a proud member of the Pantheon Podcast Network. Take care.